I'm John Underwood, and welcome to Backstory. I'm standing at the end of a cul-de-sac in the Seal Beach community of Heron Point. Behind me, brand new homes, and just beyond, the open fields of the Bixby oil land. I'm standing at the edge of the residential community of Tanglewood in Cypress. To my right, a row of upscale townhouses. To my left, a nature center that, believe it or not, doubles as coyote country. Yes, coyotes have been seen down this path here, across the street at the Ralph Shopping Center, and throughout the residential community of Tanglewood itself. And here in Rossmore proper, where homes back right up to a series of ditches and canals, what local officials call the Coyote Highway. I'm standing in the backyard of a home in the Los Alamitos community of Suburbia Estates. And this property, like all of the other locations I identified earlier, backs up to what is essentially isolated wildland area, in this case the Joint Forces Training Base right over that wall. And wherever you find isolated urban area backing up to suburban sprawl, in these parts you generally find coyotes. Now, coyotes have always been with us, around us, but never really among us. Only recently have they begun to come out of the shadows and exhibit aggressive behavior. Behavior that only comes natural for them if allowed, the scavenging for food and the taking of prey. Unfortunately, the prey they are increasingly taking these days are people's pets. Such was the case recently when coyotes scaled this wall and attacked two domestic dogs in their own backyard. The larger of the two dogs, its throat ripped open. The smaller carried off and killed. An incident that unfortunately is on the rise here in West Orange County. But the deeper fear that grips communities from Seal Beach to Cypress is the possibility that people, particularly children, could be next. Dr. Robert Timm of the University of California Hopland Extension Service and wildlife biologist and Professor Emeritus Rex Baker have been tracking aggressive coyote behavior in Southern California for decades now. Together, they have authored a seminal 2004 study identifying the accelerated stages of coyote aggression leading up to attacks on humans. They've been quoted by everyone from Department of Fish and Game to local residents, some of whom who live backed up to this so-called wildland interface have said they fear even sending their children, let alone their pets, out into their own backyards. And so I invited Dr. Timm and Rex Baker down to our own coyote ground zero here in West Orange County to assess the coyote threat for themselves and to tell us what, if anything, can be done about it. We're standing at the end, actually, of Orangewood Avenue as it exits east off of Los Alamitos Boulevard. We're literally at the fence of the Joint Forces Training Base that interfaces several areas where coyotes maneuver. In fact, there are coyote trails right through here. We've noticed earlier there is little to no policy in this area that would address coyotes in terms of eradication or elimination. We just simply have to learn to live with them, according to Fish and Game officials, for example. Professor Timm, you have, of course, support that view up to a point, but you have a little bit different perspective on things, too. Can you explain that for us?
Well, that's right. In the article you referred to in 2004, we summarized all of the problems that have occurred in urban and suburban areas, primarily Southern California, over the last 30 years or so. And what we see is an increasing number of serious incidents where coyotes interact with humans in a way that is a human health or safety threat. And sometimes that's precipitated by people intentionally feeding coyotes, which is always a bad idea. But sometimes it's just innocent folks who have their dog killed in their yard, or see a coyote in the neighborhood that's becoming more aggressive toward either people riding by on bikes or small children in the yard or whatever it is. And those are the concerns that bother us, because when those types of things happen, you can't just have a do-nothing attitude. I mean, there is some management that is appropriate, I think, and necessary to try to prevent those problems, and when they occur, to try to solve them.
Yeah, well, you pointed out some of those examples, and I think one of the examples you used was the example of Glendale, California, in which there was a very serious coyote problem up in the, I know people may not know Glendale very well, but up along Chevy Chase Avenue it's quite rural up in that area and quite hilly. Well, they had a serious coyote problem up there that was not being addressed very well until a few individuals took control of the situation. Can you explain how your research flushed out those responses?
One of the things we have now is enough incidents over enough time that you begin to see some patterns of where the problem occurs and what kind of management solutions seem to be effective. And again, most of this is anecdotal. I'm sure we don't have a complete set of information on all the incidents that have occurred, but we have some 150, 160 events that have occurred since the 1970s. Seems to be an increasing problem. We've had more of these reported in the last decade than we have in previous decades. And what's happening is that in some cases the city or the county is taking action where there's an aggressive coyote to remove that animal. Usually has to be done by lethal means, by trapping or shooting. And there's also a lot of good preventive information going on in some communities. And Glendale at one time probably had the best public education program of most of the cities that have this problem in Southern California. The police department was taking a lead role in that, but they were working with neighborhood and community groups to try to teach them about ways to make the habitat less inviting for the coyotes to be coming into the urban suburban areas. Now obviously in a lot of Southern California cities we have a lot of edge between wildlands or lands that are protected or off limits to people that coyotes perhaps can spend a lot of time in and feel very. And then the habitat where we live in our residential areas, which also provides a very ample food, and perhaps even more so than some of these set-aside areas, because there's lush vegetation, there's irrigation, there are often rodents, rabbits, and other things that are prey items. And there's pet food, and there are pets, and there's other things that coyotes will be drawn into the residential area because of those resources.
So we have two primary components. We have habitat area and we have food source.
That's right.
And of course right behind us is habitat area, the Joint Forces Training Base in Los Alamitos. I understand there are at least 2 or 3 dens in the Joint Forces Training Base. Does this area over here look like potential habitat area for coyotes?
Well, I think it does. And again, it's hard to generalize about coyotes. They're always doing something different. They're very flexible, very opportunistic. And maybe the one rule that there is about coyotes is there are no rules about coyotes. They adapt to almost any situation, and that's why they've been so hard for agricultural folks to try to deal with in terms of damage problems. But now we're seeing that problem in the suburban-urban interface. And so if we look over here and see, for example, a pile of rubble there, or some ditch banks or other locations that really there's not a lot of human activity over there perhaps, those are the ideal places for coyotes to set up a den and reproduce, and that happens typically February, March. Pups are often born in March or April. They're with the adults for a couple months, and then sometimes by that time they're on their own, finding their own territory. And so even in urban suburban areas, when the coyotes den, they try to seek an area that's kind of out of the way a little bit where they're not going to be disturbed. Sometimes they'll actually set up multiple den sites before the female gives birth to the young. And if they're disturbed too much, they'll move the pups from one den site to the next.
Yeah. And then, of course, right behind your right shoulder there is one of those ditches that you're referring to, and that butts right up to the what you call the urban wildlife interface. Those are backyards of people's homes.
Yes.
In Los Alamitos. Is that prime traveling area for a coyote?
Well, since it's fenced off and it doesn't look like there's a lot of human activity there, I would think that that's an area that coyotes could travel back and forth fairly easily and feel safe. Might not even be seen, particularly if they're traveling very early morning hours or late evening. But coyotes are bold enough, and in places in Southern California, they'll walk down the main street or down residential streets in broad daylight. And when you start seeing coyotes ignoring people and being out in the middle of the day, then you begin to worry about the fact that they've completely lost their fear of people. And I think some of them get driven over the edge when they have too much food or somebody intentionally feeds them, and then they become aggressive and become a safety threat to humans and their pets. What we do know is that when you get coyotes that have turned aggressive, it's very hard to reverse that behavior with those single individuals. And often it's just a few within a population that cause that human health and safety threat. The rest of them are ignoring people or somewhat benign, if you will. And again, then there's a sensitivity in the public toward lethal removal of coyotes or of any kind of wildlife. Because we've set up areas that are nature areas or preserves, we need some open space amidst suburbia. And we like to see wildlife. Coyotes have positive values as well. And so kind of lethal removal, whether it's by trapping or shooting, is kind of the last step. It's the last solution when you've tried everything else and it doesn't work. What the folks in Glendale and some other communities have found is that by changing the habitat to reduce food sources, sources of shelter, sources of water, you can reduce the number that are supported by a suburban environment, especially when you eliminate unintentional food sources like pet food or certain landscape plants that might be producing fruits, berries, seeds that coyotes are using. But in Glendale, they also, for a period of time, after some fairly serious incidents, removed the number of coyotes. And they got to the point where the preventive things were working better, and there were fewer and fewer coyotes that were becoming individual problems that had to be removed by trapping or shooting. And so through time, they were actually doing a pretty good job of solving the problem and minimizing the number of coyotes that actually had to be taken out of the population.
Now, let's be clear about this. When you say removing, are you referring to the actual taking of the coyote?
Yes, they're killing the coyote. I mean, we would like to, in some cases, find a new home for animals rather than having to kill them. But on the other hand, there's a liability issue. If you've got a coyote that's aggressive toward people, nobody else wants it, there's no place you can dump it off where it might not also be a problem for someone else. And it's really not humane to transport animals to a different location and just turn them loose. Usually their survival rate is low in those situations.
Is it possible to single out particularly aggressive coyotes and somehow take, trap or kill those coyotes that are particularly egregious offenders? Is that even possible?
Well, it depends upon the individual behavior of those coyotes, if they're consistently doing things. And some of the ones that have been human health and safety problems, ones that have stalked a small child or attacked and killed a pet, sometimes they get used to human routines and they'll show up at the same location at the same time every day looking for another meal. And so in many cases, whether it's USDA Wildlife Services trappers or whether it's law enforcement or Fish and Game or somebody else, when they have had a complaint, the coyote's predictable enough or the neighborhood residents have seen it often enough that they can pretty much tell you where it's going to be and when it's going to be there. And often those coyotes can be fairly easily removed by professionals. Now this shouldn't be done by the general public dealing with it. In fact, it's illegal to trap coyotes in California with leg hole traps unless an agency has declared there to be a health and safety issue. So that's the one instance left now in California where you can legally use padded leg hole traps. It's where you have a human health and safety issue.
And what would constitute specifically a health and human safety issue?
Basically a coyote that's coming too close to people or has demonstrated aggressive behavior toward people.
Not necessarily an outright attack on people?
No. It could be just a coyote that's acting aggressively, acting strangely, could have stalked somebody. Any of those things raises some significant questions about whether that coyote might, in the near future, actually attack someone. Yeah. Or attack a pet, even.
Well, we have the habitat over here at the base, and I'm sure there are others in the area. We have the Coyote Highway, as so defined by Fish and Game, with this ditch area over here, just one example of it. And then, of course, at this intersection also is a very broad, is actually the back of a school, St. Hedwig's School. And a very well-populated baseball field and a track facility, several diamonds over here. These are school hours at the moment, but after school, this whole area will be essentially flooded with kids participating in free activity and organized sports. Does this interface of these three environments trouble you?
Well, it does resemble some situations where we already are familiar with attack incidents that have occurred, and I think some of those have been in school properties in Orange County in the past. The potential is there, and it's really hard to predict in any one situation whether or not a future incident's going to occur. But what Rex Baker and my colleague, who's now retired from Cal Poly Pomona, has defined is when you start seeing coyotes that are either ignoring people or pretty bold around people and start approaching within fairly short distances, and I'm talking, 20, 30, 40, 50 feet or closer, And when you see coyotes in the middle of the day that are wandering around public places or parks, neighborhoods, school grounds, residential areas where there's human activity, those are all signs that you could be leading up to behavior that's going to result in an attack. And when you have coyotes attacking and killing pets, dogs and cats, and that sometimes even happens, people that are walking dogs and have them on a leash and the coyote attacks very close to the human, those are all things that seem to be precursors to human attacks taking place. Hard to predict it exactly, but that creates enough of a safety concern that I think most people would say, yes, something needs to be done about those situations. And the only thing we know now is that the removal of a few coyotes out of those populations by shooting or trapping seems to wise up the whole population. And sometimes removing 2 or 3 or 4 coyotes in a neighborhood solves the problem for months, if not years.
This is Orville Lewis Park in the Highlands community of Los Alamitos. And it's along and through this fence line that coyotes have been entering these communities, residents say, on an increasing basis lately. A number of holes in this fence have been fixed by the city of Los Alamitos just recently. But patching the coyote problem in this town may prove to be a more complicated fix. This young coyote, in the video taken just a few days ago by me, shows him approaching the gate at the back of Lewis Park in broad daylight when it spotted me watching it. It hesitated for a moment, more curious it seemed than afraid, and then it moved on. With me now is wildlife biologist Rex Baker, who has spent the morning with me surveying coyote hotspots across West Orange County. We're standing in one of those coyote hotspots, Orville Lewis Park, where earlier we got some videotape footage of a coyote approaching this fence and gate here. Professor Baker, the city has gone to some length trying to block some of the egregious holes in this fence. Is this, at this point, is this fence going to keep coyotes out?
No, I'm afraid it won't, John. Coyotes have been known to climb chain link fences quite rapidly and come right over the top. And since this barbed wire is down and not strung tight, and there's hair right here, coyote hair, on the top of the fence, which shows they have been going over the fence here. There's also an opening in the gate there that anything...
Right here?
Right. Anything larger than 3.5 inches, a coyote can go through.
They can go right through this little hole right here?
They can go right through a hole like that. Even a full-grown coyote. And so they've made an attempt here, but that won't do it.
I understand coyotes, urban coyotes, are actually bigger than coyotes you find in rural areas or out in the countryside.
We're finding some coyotes that are 45 pounds and larger, slightly larger, and it seems like the diet is so good and they have to expend very little energy to get their diet here in the human area. You know, there's plenty of pets, there's pet food, there's plenty of water, there's a lot of fruit on a lot of the trees, both ornamental trees and fruit gardens and vegetable gardens in people's yards. So they don't have to work very hard to expend much energy like they would if they're out in the wild chasing rabbits all day.
Yeah. So do we have a public safety hazard here in Los Alamitos, here in West Orange County?
Well, in my opinion, you definitely do. Your activity that we've seen of the dog being attacked in the presence of its owner is a level 5 out of 7 levels of coyote behavior, indicating there's no fear of man. And level 5 would be very high. 7 is the highest level threat to man. So yes, we have a fear of that, and we want to, it's at the point where you want to stop that before something happens to, like Weston Fields, a young child who was attacked up in Simi Valley. He and 4 other children were attacked back in 2004. And this kind of activity started occurring before that attack and many others. And so now is the time. Yes, you have a human safety issue here.
We had, we've been more or less dealing with this now for many months now. In fact, Just before the new year, we had a workshop here in Los Alamitos in which a Fish and Game representative came down and another individual, a biologist, came down and essentially said, there's not much you can do. Just leave them alone. They're part of nature, and all you can do is remove some food from your porch and so forth. And is that a misconception?
It's a misconception when it comes to coyotes. I mean, basically their philosophy is to try to learn to live with wildlife. But once coyotes have become aggressive and bold, they use our threshold level, the 7 steps that we've been talking about of awareness, coyote human awareness, and to indicate when you can use soft catch traps, when there is a threat to human safety. And generally beyond stage 4, trapping is something that has to be done. And Fish and Game recognizes that. And I've talked to them since that interview, and the people that came down were really not people who deal with it. They weren't game wardens, they weren't biologists working for Fish and Game, and they didn't truly understand that. But they are aware of your situation here in Los Alamitos, and they are in favor of the city doing what they have to do to eliminate the bold coyotes.
Well, in fact, the city of Los Alamitos has initiated some action. They have hired now a basically pest control management company to come out and survey the site. I don't believe that they have laid any traps yet, but soon they will, and they're going to be laying what they call leg snare traps. Is that the only option to ameliorate mitigate the problem with coyotes? Or are there other options? How do you feel about that?
No, there are other options, John, than trapping. Trapping is the one thing that does have a long-lasting effect on coyotes, because they're in the trap and they're alarming other coyotes as they're trapped in that trap for a period of time. So it has a good effect. However, when you're dealing with a situation like this, where the base is the primary source of coyotes that we've seen, and we know that they're out there, we know that they have dens out there and they're young out there, and it's a very large area, so shooting would be an excellent option, where you go to the center of the base in a nice safe area, you call the coyotes in, having them go after prey, what they think is a prey for them, and then you take them on the base. And that's the way I would start the program, to do that first, to knock down the numbers, and then I'd go to trapping.
Yeah, now I understand you have had a meeting with the general, and sounds like the general is amenable to that. Is that correct?
General Combs is. He wants to solve the problem, and he knows that they're on the base and that it's a problem.
Okay. Now, one point I'd like to get to that was quite interesting to me was this order in which things should be done. In your 2004 study, you identified these 7 steps toward of coyote aggressive behavior leading up to attacks on humans.
Correct.
And you mentioned that we're somewhere around stage 5, very
right.
close to attack on human. Is the response at this point, which response would be most warranted, do you feel, at this point?
Well, it would be the trapping that they're doing, or the trapping and the shooting, but taking of the animals would be the thing that you want to do. And that is the one thing that must be done before you start taking away their food sources and cleaning up their habitat by pruning up the shrubs and that type of thing. Otherwise, you change their behavior, and they become, as we've seen in a number of cases, they actually become more aggressive. And in Griffith Park and a number of other cases that are in our studies that we've studied, where the people were recommended to trap or take the coyotes, the bull coyotes, and they put it off, and instead they covered trash cans, they took the food away, they didn't let people feed the coyotes, etc. And then you had aggressive behavior towards humans, increased dramatically within weeks. Mm-hmm. So you should take action like they are.
And as far as the base is concerned, would the most appropriate action on the base be the taking by shooting, would you say?
Yes, I think that'd be the most appropriate. Now, they can use leg hold traps along the perimeter of the base also, but the most effective would be to go right away. And I say that now at this time of the year because the female is ready to take the young out and train them, and they're going to teach them to get their food in an urban area, and we don't want that. We want them to be afraid of mankind rather than dependent upon mankind for food.
Okay, so We're at the point now where we have to take action. There's no going back at this point, it sounds like.
Correct.
We have to do something because the coyotes aren't going to recede back into the darkness on their own. Or have you ever seen that happen?
No, we've never seen that happen. What we've seen happen is when trapping programs take effect and then people become educated enough to remove the food sources.
Secondarily.
Secondarily, and then clean up the habitat, otherwise shrubs prune up off the ground so they don't have a place to hide and so forth. We've seen the effects last for years. You know, there's no more coyote problem for years. And then if they start increasing again, they start seeing early in the earlier stages 1 and 2 behavior, then they can try scaring them away. But to scare now, scare tactics don't work right now. It's too aggressive. People can do that in the individual backyards, use air horns and things like that to scare them off out of their yard, but it's not going to take the aggressive, bold behavior out of the coyotes at this point.
And from what you've seen, we have a more aggressive situation that requires a more aggressive response at this point than just simply mitigating by removing food sources.
Correct, and we're about to get another generation of young coyotes that are going to be trained to do the same, so the situation is going to be a lot worse if something isn't done.
Okay, all right, we'll leave it at that. Professor Baker, thank you very much for lending your time and your expertise to our particular coyote dilemma here in West Orange County. I also want to thank Professor Robert Timm and the University of California Extension Service at Hopland for their cooperation and their involvement, and also to let you know that just this month, I'm informed by Dr. Timm and his associates that they'll be launching a coyote website that will be addressing and updating the problems of coyote aggression in urban communities, and you can catch that on the website. And I also want to point out that Dr. Timm encourages anyone who's been a victim or observer of aggressive coyote behavior to document individual incidences of that behavior on their UC website link, shown here. Well, we'll put that website up for you once again at the very tail end of the show. And so for Backstory, this is John Underwood. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time.